It was late afternoon when I was cleaning my bedroom, and I heard the door creak behind me. Turning around, I saw Liam standing in the doorway staring at the item I was holding. My heart stopped. How could I explain this? The object was anything but innocent, a large, brightly coloured toy, one that no polite conversation could ignore. I'd pulled it out of the drawer to clean behind the cabinet, not thinking much of it. I had locked the door, or so I thought. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. Liam was my 23-year-old stepson. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked at a local brewery and usually hung out late with his friends after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his amused blue eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his voice somewhere between curiosity and teasing. My face turned bright red. I dropped the item as if it had burned me, grabbing the first thing I could, a throw pillow from the bed, to cover it. "It's none of your business," I stammered, my throat tightening. But his expression remained unchanged. He leaned against the door frame, his curiosity growing. "You know you don't have to act so embarrassed," he said, with a slight smirk. "It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." I felt like crawling into a hole. The audacity of this man, standing there so casually, unfazed, while my world was spiraling out of control. I forced a nervous laugh, desperate to shift the focus. "Liam, seriously, go mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." But he didn't move. For a moment, the silence hung heavy between us. He wasn't looking at the pillow anymore, but at me. His gaze felt different, longer, more intense than the usual playful glances. It felt like he had peeled back a layer of who I thought I was and found something else entirely. I felt a strange flicker of warmth deep inside, followed by guilt. This was wrong. I was his stepmother. I was married to his father. I shook my head and broke the silence. "Please, Liam, just go." He finally shrugged, lifting his hands in mock surrender. Okay," he said, his tone light again. But before leaving, he gave me one last look that sent my already uneasy thoughts spinning. As the door closed behind him, I sat on the edge of the bed, the pillow still pressed to my chest. My heart raced. I couldn't even bring myself to put the toy back into the drawer. It felt like something invisible had shifted between us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew I'd never look at Liam the same way again. That evening, I couldn't shake the moment. I tried to focus. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and even sat next to Nathan on the couch while he watched old westerns on TV. But Liam's face, his smirk, and the unsettling gleam in his eyes haunted me. Nathan hardly noticed my distraction. As always, he had been absorbed in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, since retiring. I didn't resent him for it. That would have been too easy. But sometimes I felt more like a live-in caretaker than a wife. At one point, I caught sight of Liam's shadow moving around in his room. I could hear the faint hum of music, a low bass line that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet house. My heart skipped for reasons I couldn't explain, and I turned my attention back to Nathan. He was snoring softly, chin tilted downward, asleep in his recliner with the TV still droning on. I thought about waking him, but what would be the point? Instead, I got up and wandered into the kitchen, grateful for a brief moment alone. But it didn't last long. Liam entered, his bare feet soft against the hardwood floor. He wore a faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled as if he had run his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, opening the fridge and grabbing a bottle of water. "You're up late," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. He smiled, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding. It's not easy living here sometimes." The comment made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but there was something serious behind his expression. "It's nothing, just living here again, I guess. I feel like I don't fit anymore." I softened. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a little maternal concern. "It's just temporary, Liam. You'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet." "Thanks, Sophia," he said, his voice softer. "I appreciate that." For a moment, we stood in silence, the kitchen feeling smaller as the ikantai space between us closed. He didn't look away, and I felt that same strange warmth in my chest. I cleared my throat and busied myself with wiping the counter, trying to break the tension. But Liam wasn't done. "About earlier," he said, his tone playful again. "You don't have to be embarrassed, you know. We're all human, right?" My hand froze, and I turned to him, trying to keep my composure. "Liam, let's not talk about that, all right? It was an accident, and it's not worth bringing up again." "Okay," he said, raising his hands in surrender. But there was still a teasing edge in his smile that made my stomach flip. He walked past me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. I didn't turn around, but I felt his presence behind me, before he finally left the kitchen. That night, as I lay in bed next to Nathan, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. What was I doing? I had always been able to keep clear boundaries, lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But Liam had a way of bending those lines without even trying, and the worst part was I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast as I always did: eggs, toast, and coffee for Nathan, a smoothie for myself. Liam was the last to come into the kitchen, his hair still damp from the shower. He greeted Nathan with a casual morning and me with a warm smile that made my pulse race. We sat at the table, the sound of silverware clinking and snippets of conversation filling the air. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension. Every time Liam's hand brushed mine while passing the salt or refilling coffee, it felt deliberate. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Nathan, of course, noticed nothing. After breakfast, Liam offered to help me clean up. Normally, he would have disappeared into his room or out with friends, so his offer caught me off guard. "You don't have to," I said, stacking plates in the sink. "I want to," he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. We worked in silence for a while, but the air felt charged. At one point, I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled away. "You're different," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat dry. He hesitated, searching my eyes. "I don't know. You just don't act like other women your age." I laughed nervously, stepping back to create some space. "Well, that's flattering, I suppose." "It's not just that," he continued. "You're real. You actually listen. You see people." The sincerity in his voice took me by surprise. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes. But as I scrubbed, I felt his presence close behind me again. My heart raced, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there. Before I could gather my thoughts, Nathan's voice called from the living room. "Sophia, where's my crossword book?" The moment broke, and Liam stepped back, giving me a small, knowing smile. "I'll let you get back to him," he said, his voice light as he walked away. I felt a mix of relief and longing. I knew I was playing with fire, but part of me couldn't resist reaching for the heat. That afternoon, I kept myself busy with errands, trying to avoid thinking about everything that had happened. But when I returned home, I found Liam sitting on the porch steps, staring off into the yard. He seemed deep in thought, a far cry from the confident young man I usually saw. "Hey," I said softly as I approached. He looked up and smiled slightly. "Hey." "Everything okay?" I asked, sitting beside him, keeping some distance but close enough to feel his warmth. He hesitated before answering. "Yeah, just thinking about life, where I'm headed, what I should be doing. I couldn't help but feel a little sympathy." "You're young, Liam. You don't have to have it all figured out." He looked at me, his eyes fixed on the yard. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Do you ever feel like you're meant for something different? Like you're stuck in the wrong story?" His damn words struck me harder than I wanted to admit. I wanted to comfort him, tell him everything would be okay, but the truth was, I wasn't sure it would be. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "You're not stuck," I said, hoping he wouldn't notice the tremor in my voice. For a moment, his hand covered mine, and the simple gesture felt more intimate than I cared to admit. I pulled my hand away quickly, but the damage was done. Another boundary crossed, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it. Later that evening, the sky darkened, signaling the arrival of a storm. The air seemed heavy, like the world was waiting for something to happen. Nathan had gone to bed early, complaining of a sore shoulder. I settled into the living room with a book, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the restlessness. I felt inside, something unpredictable, something dangerous. I could hear Liam in the kitchen, the fridge opening and closing, followed by the soft clink of glass. A few moments later, he appeared in the doorway, 2 glasses in hand. "Whiskey?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late." "Well, maybe tonight's an exception," he said with a grin, handing me a glass without waiting for a response. I hesitated, but took it. The cool glass felt solid in my hand, grounding me as Liam sank into the armchair across from me. The lamp beside me cast a warm glow across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint shadow of stubble. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting," he smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a sip of the whiskey. The burn was a welcome distraction from the tension building in the room. We sat in silence for a while, the storm outside intensifying. But then Liam spoke again, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at him, wary. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the liquid in his glass, eyes fixed on it as if gathering his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" His question startled me. It was so similar to the one he had asked earlier on the porch, but now there was a different weight to it. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice softer than I meant. Liam looked up at me, his eyes meeting mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." My cheeks flushed, and I looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Liam, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "It's true," he said. His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I stood up abruptly, needing some space. "I think it's time we called it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze. But just as I turned to leave, the lights flickered and the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting and I froze mid-step. "Oh," I muttered, my voice shaky. "It's just the storm," Liam said, calm as ever. "Hold on," I'll find a flashlight." I heard him move closer, the faint rustle of his clothes brushing past me. Then his hand brushed against mine in the dark, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His hand lingered, warm and steady against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. I couldn't move, my heart was pounding, and I felt like he could hear it too. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned toward him, even though I couldn't see him in the dark. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, his breath. Then his hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, but his grip didn't loosen. The first crack of lightning illuminated the room briefly, and in that moment I saw his face, vulnerable, close, and impossibly earnest. And then he kissed me. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt, as if he were the only thing solid in a world spinning out of control. When the lights flickered back on, we pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily. The reality of what we had just done hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands trembling. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head. Liam didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said, his voice steady, "but the damage was already done." The next few days were a blur of stolen glances and unspoken words. I avoided Liam as much as possible, throwing myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feeling of his lips on mine or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist. One evening, while I was folding laundry in the guest room, Liam appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he replied, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. I sighed, setting the laundry down and meeting his gaze. "Liam, whatever this is, it has to stop." "It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't understand. If Nathan ever found—" "Oh, he won't," Liam interrupted. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. I had to stop this. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising. "It's about us. Whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible." Liam stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Why?" "Because you're afraid of what people will think? Because you're afraid of what you might think?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My silence spoke for me. "Sophia," he continued, softly, "I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either." Tears pricked at my eyes and I looked away. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice pleading. But I couldn't explain it. I couldn't put into words the guilt, the fear, the longing I felt. So I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of Nathan's breathing. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, and I couldn't seem to untangle them. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water would calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Liam's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, as if he had been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, unable to find my words. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the silence heavy between us. And then, without thinking, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was, this impossible, dangerous thing between us, it wasn't going away. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there wasn't a storm to blame, nor a flickering light to hide behind. This time, it was deliberate. It started in the laundry room of all places. I was pulling warm towels. From the dryer, the steady rhythm of folding them offering me some kind of escape. The house was quiet. Nathan had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "You're always working?" Liam said, his voice light, but with a tone I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough, but don't you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" I asked, feeling confused. "Taking care of everything? Taking care of everyone? When's the last time someone took care of you?" His words cut through me like a knife. I turned, clutching a folded towel to my chest like a shield. "Liam, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having." "Why not?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, but his eyes were sharp, searching me with an intensity I wasn't used to. "Because," I said, my voice faltering, "it's not appropriate." "Appropriate?" he repeated, as if testing the word. "That's not the same as honest, though, is it?" I wanted to argue, to shut him down before he could say anything else that would make this worse. But before I could, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "You don't have to pretend with me, Sophia," he said softly. "I see you. I see the way you carry this house, how you hold everything together while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself?" My throat tightened, and I shook my head, stepping back until I felt the edge of the counter behind me.
"Liam, whatever this is, it has to stop."
He reached out his hand, brushing against mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I couldn't lie to him. I couldn't lie to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. This time, I didn't stop him. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Liam was good at finding excuses to linger around me, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet door, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first, it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden. But the reality of it weighed heavily on me. I knew it couldn't last. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One afternoon, while I was putting away groceries, Liam came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing toward the doorway to make sure no one was there. "Liam!" I hissed, trying to pull away. "Nathan could walk in any minute." "Nathan's at the hardware store," he said calmly. "Relax." But I couldn't relax, not anymore. The paranoia was starting to eat away at me. Every time Nathan looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time Claire, our nosy neighbor, waved at
Me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me.
We need to talk, I said, turning to face Liam. About what? He asked, his expression unreadable. About this, about us. His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. What about us? This has to stop, I said, forcing the words out. It's too risky. It's not fair to Nathan. Fair to Nathan? He repeated, his voice rising. What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want. What I want doesn't matter, I snapped. It's not about me. Sophia, he shot back, you deserve to be happy. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't because deep down I knew he was right. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Nathan invited Claire and her husband over for dinner, and I was doing my best to play the role of the perfect hostess. But Claire's sharp eyes seemed to be on me all night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. After dinner, as I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Claire cornered me. You've been awfully distracted lately, she said, her tone casual, but her eyes probing. Just busy, I replied, forcing a smile. You know how it is. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Does Nathan know? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. No, I said, my voice barely audible. I shrugged, her expression unreadable. Whatever's going on with you and Liam. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaking. Claire smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Just be careful, Sophia. Secrets have a way of coming out. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Claire's words in my mind. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next morning, Liam found me in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. You're avoiding me, he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. I'm trying to protect us, I replied, not looking up. Protect us from what? He asked, stepping closer. From this blowing up in our faces, I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans. Claire knows? He frowned, his expression darkening. How could she know? I don't know, but she does, I said, my voice rising. And if she tells Nathan? Nathan won't, he said firmly. You don't know that, I snapped. You don't understand how dangerous this is. Liam grabbed my hand, his grip strong but not painful. What I understand is that I don't want to lose you. The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard. For
a moment, I didn't know what to say. You won't, I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. But we have to be careful for both our sakes. The days that followed were tense.
Claire didn't say anything to Nathan, at least not that I knew of, but the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a cloud. Liam tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then one evening, Nathan came home earlier than
expected. I was in the laundry room with Liam, the two of us standing closer than we should have been when we heard the front door open. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Sophia, Nathan called, his voice carrying through the house.
In here, I replied, my voice steady, despite the panic rising in my chest. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the room. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, but then he just nodded. Dinner ready? I asked, quickly, trying to change the subject. Almost, I added. He left without another word, but the look he gave me lingered long after he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in the laundry room, the way Nathan's eyes, had lingered on me just a second too long. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever this was between Liam and me, it felt too big, too consuming to simply walk away from. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. It started with Nathan coming home unexpectedly early, but this time it wasn't just the timing that caught me off guard. His face was tight, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the house and set his briefcase down with a deliberate thud.
"Liam!" Nathan called, his voice sharp enough to make my stomach drop. Liam appeared in the hallway moments later, his casual demeanor in stark contrast to Nathan's obvious tension. "What's up?" he asked, leaning against the wall, his hands in
his pockets. Nathan's eyes narrowed. "We need to talk, now." The tone of his voice left no room for argument. Liam glanced at me briefly, concern flickering in his eyes before following Nathan into the living room. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding. I couldn't hear their words at first, just the low rumble of Nathan's voice and the occasional, quieter responses from Liam. But as their conversation escalated, the words became clear. "I know what's been going on," Nathan said, his voice cold as ice. "What are you talking about?" Liam replied, his voice steady but guarded. "Don't play dumb with me," Nathan snapped. "I've seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. Do you think I'm blind?" My blood ran cold. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to confront Liam. "Nathan, you're imagining things,"
Liam said, his voice steadier than I thought possible. "There's nothing going on. Don't lie to me," Nathan roared.
The sound of something breaking, a glass maybe, followed. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I stepped into the doorway, my hands trembling. "Nathan, stop!" I shouted. Both men turned to me, their expressions the complete opposite. Nathan's face was a mix of anger and betrayal, while Liam's held something more akin to defiance. "Sophia?" Nathan said, his voice quieter, but no less dangerous. "Tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you two?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My silence was my answer. Nathan laughed bitterly, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I knew it," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to believe it, but I knew." "Nathan, please," I said, stepping closer to him. "Don't," he snapped, holding up a hand, "and don't try to explain it. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay." The room fell into a heavy silence, only broken by the sound of the clock ticking. Finally, Nathan turned to Liam, his eyes blazing. "You're out," Nathan said coldly. "Pack your things and leave tonight." Liam stood his ground, his jaw tightening. "I'm not going anywhere." "Yes, you are," Nathan shot back. "You're not staying
under my roof and disrespecting me like this." "I think you should calm down," Liam said, his tone low but firm. That only made Nathan angrier. He stepped closer to Liam, fists clenched. "Don't tell me to calm down, you little—" "Stop it!" I shouted, stepping between them. "Both of you, just stop!" Nathan turned to me, his eyes filled with hurt. "How could you, Sophia?" he asked, his voice breaking. "After everything I've done for you." "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," Nathan said bitterly. "And now I have to deal with the fact that my own wife and my son—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I can't even say it." Liam reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't handle his touch, at least not now, not with Nathan watching. I think it's best if I leave, I said quietly. Nathan stared at me, his face hardening. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. This is my house. If anyone's leaving, it's him. Nathan, I began, but he cut me off. No, he said.
Don't want to hear it. You've made your choice, Sophia, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. Liam left that night. He packed a bag without a word, his movements tense and mechanical. I followed him to the driveway, my heart breaking with every step. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. He turned to me, his expression softer than I expected. This isn't over, he said, his voice steady. You know that, right? I nodded but didn't say anything because, as much as I wanted to believe him, I wasn't sure if it was true. As his car disappeared down the street, I felt an ache deep in my chest, a mix of guilt, loss, and something I couldn't quite name. The days that followed were unbearable. Nathan barely spoke to me, his silence more punishing than any words could have been. I threw myself into household tasks, desperate to keep busy, but nothing could distract me from the emptiness I felt. Then a week later, the letter arrived. It was from Liam. There was no return address, just my name, written in his familiar handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I unfolded the paper. Sophia, the letter began. I know things are complicated right now, but I need you to know that I meant what I said. This isn't over. I don't care what anyone else thinks or says. I can't just walk away from you. I won't. When you're ready, I'll be waiting. Always. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to burn it and pretend it never existed. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit, clung to his words like a lifeline. That night, I tucked the letter into the back of my dresser drawer, hiding it away like a secret I wasn't ready to share with the world. Because deep down, I knew Liam was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.